We'll do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik of Hey. This is the first Sicha for the Parshas Vayigash. The Rebbe talks about the fact that the Jewish people in Tehillim, David HaMelech refers to them as Yosef. And that is based on the fact, Rashi says, because in our Parsha we see that Yosef fed all the Yidden, he supported them, so he sustained them. And the Rebbe says, especially in the days of hunger, at that point they needed him, and without him they couldn't survive. But the Rebbe, and that's why he called Yosef. But the Rebbe wants to know, but that just happened a small period of history. At that period of time, he supported the Yidden that they sustained them. But why would we call Yidden all the time, especially in this Perek Tilim, in which he calls the Yidden Yosef? It follows the Yidden being called Yisrael. So, what's the special connection over here of Yosef? The Rebbe explains that Yosef is what sustains us and gives us koyach to go through the exile. That parak of Tehillim discusses the exile and the challenges of exile. So, unlike anyone else, Yosef is the one that feeds us the spiritual support, just like he fed us the physical support. The Rebbe draws on the life of Yaakov, that also Yaakov went through sort of exile more than the other forefathers, but ultimately it was Yosef who was really engaged in Mitzrayim, and yet he was able to come out on top. So that feeds us. That's the lesson for us. We're learning the Sicha Lilo Nishmas, our son, Rav Levi Yitzchak, whose dedication and the service as a shaliach to the Rebbe, and also to mention Hashem Yinkem Domam should be for the shaliach who was just this in first day of Hanukkah in Sydney, Australia, was murdered by these Rotzim Yamach Shemam cowards who killed him with 12 others and many injured. Hashem Yinkum Domum, and send the refuah shleim ukreva to all those injured. We'll look inside and we'll go step by step. Vayigash Aleph. Oifun Posik Roya Yisrael Hazino Noya Katsoin Yosef. So this is in Tehillim Perik Pei 80 Posik base. So it says, referring to the Eibishter, we call him Roya Yisrael, who shepherds Israel. And we're saying to the Eibishter, to the shepherd of Israel, Hazina, listen. We're asking Hashem to listen to us. And then we say, Noyhe Katsoin Yosef, the one who leads like the cattle, the sheep, Yosef. Basically, that the Eibishter leads the sheep, leads Yosef, leads the Jewish people. And we're asking the Eibishter to support us. We're asking the Eibishter's help. Why are the Yidden called here Yosef? He leads like sheep Yosef, that's the Yidden. First he says Roya Yisrael. Now he's saying he leads Yosef, like Tzoyin Yosef, that Yosef, the Jewish people are called Yosef. Taitz Rashi, so Rashi translates. Called Yisrael Nikroim al Shem Yosef. All Israel is called by the name of Yosef, on the name of Yosef. Lefi Shehu Pirnesam, he sustained, supported them. V'chilkelam, he fed them. Bimei Harov, during the days of the hunger. V'yashteit in unser Parsha, and this is the connection to our Parsha, it says, V'yichalkel Yosef es Echov, as Aviv as Echov as Kol Beis Aviv Lechem Lefi Hatov, that Yosef fed his father and his brothers and all of the family of his father bread according to the children, whatever they needed. Yosef sustained them, Yosef fed them. And because of that, he is called, the Yidden are called Yosef because he sustained them. So we are basically Yosef sustained by Yosef. So, what is the meaning over here? The Pashtus lernt men. So simply, we learn. Bald Yosef hat die Bnei Yisrael gespeist in a Zeit von Hunger, since Yosef fed the Yidden in a time when there was hunger, which means that they needed Yosef for their sustenance. Without Yosef, they could not survive. Was this meant as their kiyum is given abhängig in Yosef? That means that their sustenance, that their existence is hinged on Yosef. Yosef is responsible for them to continue to exist. The Farber is Yongruf. That's why we call them by his name, because he is their supporter. Al Shem Zev was the fact, because he sustained, held up their existence so that they can exist. They're called Yosef because Yosef gave them the means to survive. He sustained them. And that's why they're called by the name of Yosef. And the Rebbe makes now a very interesting note. The Rebbe points out something very beautiful. Rashi, the posik that we quoted, that he sustained them, is talking about after Yosef, after Yaakov already came to Yosef, to Mitzrayim. At that point, when Yaakov came to Mitzrayim, our sages tell us, Rashi brings it down, that the hunger already stopped. And then later on, it came back after the Yaakov's passing. But at that period of time, when he sustained them, when the Pasuk says, the Rebbe quoted, "Vayichalkel Yosef, there was no hunger." So why does Rashi say Bimei Harov? It's not Bimei Harov that he supported them, but the idea is the reason they're called on Shem Yosef is not for the time that he sustained them then, but it was in the time of the Rav. This was a continuation. Let's look inside. The meat is Recht Loshen Rashi. This makes Rashi's language very specific, correct. The Rashi specifically uses Pirnasam v'chilkalam b'meharav, that he supported them and fed them the day of hunger. Now we need to understand that. Because we were explaining that they're called Yosef because he sustained them, we understand why Rashi specifically says that he sustained them in the time of hunger. The L'chaira, the pasuk by Chalkel Yosef Gomer, this pasuk of Yosef fed that we quoted, the Red Wengenum Zman, it talks about the time when Yaakov u'bonav zayin shegiven in Mitzrayim, that Yaakov and his son were already in Egypt. Und es ist schon bottle geworden darauf, and the hunger has already ceased. There was no more hunger. K'maimer Chazal, as our sages of blessed memory tell us, Mikivan Shabo Yaakov leMitzrayim, Bavracha v'kol harav. Once Yaakov came to Mitzrayim, the blessing came, and there was no more hunger. So we see that at that point there was no hunger over there. So why does Rashi say he fed them in the days of the hunger when this wasn't the day of hunger? But now we understand it, because we want to say why they're called Yosef, because he sustained them. It is specifically because he sustained them and fed them in the days of hunger. Even before, that was before they came to Egypt. By Yosef and Mitzrayim, that was before they moved, the sons of Yaakov, the brothers of Yosef, before they moved to Egypt. We're talking about B'mei Harav, when they still lived in Canaan, and they bought the grain by Yosef and Mitzrayim. And also Nochis Talkusa Shel Yosef, Yaakov, also after the passing of Yaakov and Chozar Harav, the hunger came back, as brought down in Tosefta. Und Yosef hat zugesagt, Echav, Anochi achalke eschem ve'estapchem. He told them, I will feed you and your son, when he was telling them to move to Mitzrayim. Hat man gesehen, wie der Kiyum von Beis Yisrael, that's when they saw that the existence of the Jewish home is given operating in Yosef, was dependent on Yosef. So Rashi doesn't just say that he fed them, but that wouldn't mean that they are hinged on him, that they are relying on him, that they need him for their existence. But it's dafke because of what we see be hunger time before and later on, that he's going to feed them. That's why they all got the name Yosef. They didn't get the name Yosef because they needed Yosef to sustain them. They could not exist without Yosef, so that's why we called them Yosef. Okay, so this explains to us why they're called Yosef. But why always call them Yosef? This was just a one-time occurrence. And then why specifically in this parsha, in this Perik Tilim, in Perik Pei, after saying Roi Yisrael, we add another prayer of Yosef. What is the connection? How does this add more to this Perik to call the Jewish people Yosef? But therefore, wir verstehen Bei ist Aleph. Für was sollen Iden ständig angerufen werden mit dem Namen Yosef, mit Sadap Uluf Yosef? Why should Iden always be called Yosef because of something that Yosef did? Welches gewähnt mit viel Jahren früher. That took place many years earlier. Boys b'meshach von Agor kurzer Zeit. It was a small duration of time. It wasn't such a long time. So, okay, Yosef sustained them, but why we're calling Yidden forever on the name of Yosef? Because there was a small duration of time that he sustained them. Base. But the main question we need to understand, what's the connection over here? The Teuchen HaKosuv, the content, what is the pasuk talking about? Raya Yisrael Hazino. We're saying the shepherd of Israel, listen to us. And no Yakatzon Yosef Hoifia appear. We're asking the Eberster's help. Is Abakosha vos mebedem Eberster. This is a request that we're requesting from Hashem. Hazino Hoifia, listen to us. Appear. Was the Funis verstandig. So from this we understand, this helps this request. As mit Batzeichen and Eden als Yosef, that the fact that we are describing Yidden as being Yosef, wird ausgedrückt am Meile von Eden. This expresses an advantage, a greatness about Yidden, welche gitzu azchus of milabakosha, which adds a merit. So for Hashem to fulfill the request from Hazinoifia of listen, appear, this is why we're asking Hashem, because we're Yisrael, we're Yosef. Nochmer. It's not only that this has an impact, but we say Yosef after Yisrael. So we're saying Hashem to listen to us because of Yisrael, and then not only because of Yisrael, because when you ask, you start from this lesser and you built it up. So Yisrael, and we're also Yosef. Nochmer. Von dem was die Wörter neue Katzon Yosef kommen nach dem ersten Teil Abakosha. The fact that neue Katzon Yosef comes after the first part of the request. Roye Yisrael Hazino. So we have Roye Yisrael Hazino is mashma. It appears as the nomen Yosef is aggressor and Maila, that the name Yosef is a greater advantage with the Shem Yisrael than the name Yisrael. That's what we say. Raya Yisrael, Noya Katzain Yosef. I'll call upon him, benegay the union in the Mizbar. Okay, at least. Maybe generally Yosef is not greater in Yisrael, but in this Mizbar, in this song, in this chapter 80, what we're asking for over here, it's important. And we're saying, well, they are Yisrael, and on top of that, they're also Yosef. What is the meaning? Vorum der Seder Atfila is because the order normally when you ask Hashem is kimuvon, as I understand, is minakal el hakovet. You go start with this lower, with the easier, and then you go to heavier. Frier der Mond menaklener maila. First, you mention a smaller level, und der noch, And then later on, after you say first you're Yisrael, and then following that, especially if the first saying, oh, they're Yisrael, that is not sufficient, then you had a greater advantage. Oh, they're also Yisrael. So, what is it about this here that Yosef fed them that made them greater level that Hashem should listen? Isn't it move on mitvos is those was Yosef pirnesom bechil kilam b'meirov? How is this that Yosef supported them and fed them in the days of the hunger? Aschus unamayla farkol Yisrael. How is this a merit and a greatness for all Yidden? Adozo poil zayin, that this should impact or akoparim help. Whether this is the whole impact because they're called Yosef, or it at least should help out them hazino ifia, the listening and ifia. The Rebbe wants to know. Here we're asking the Eibishter to listen to us, to appear to us, based upon the fact that we're Yisrael, and then we're saying, and also if Yisrael is not enough, so to speak, then we're also Yosef. What is this about Yosef that we're asking Hashem over here? Pay attention to us. Appear to us because we are Yosef. What's the special about Yosef that we're using this in this chapter of Tillim as a reason for Hashem to listen and to appear to us? And the Rebbe explains that this chapter of Tillim talks about exile, talks about 3 exiles that the Yidden had to go through, and Yosef is what gives us the koyach to go through these exile. And that's why we're saying to Hashem, Hazina, because we are working like Yosef, who supported them, as the Rebbe will continue to explain. So we can say the point of the explanation of this, that when we talk about physical matters, Yosef supported them. That's in a physical way, he fed them. But Yosef also feeds us in a time of distress, in a time of exile, time of difficulty. Yosef feeds us. Yet der inyan gashmi, every physical item, it begins and it evolves from its spiritual source. The same is true in our case. Those of us pirnesom b'chilkelom b'mei harov b'pashtus b'gashmis. The fact that Yosef supported them and fed them during the days of hunger when there's hunger, b'pashtus, because we're going to allude that Yosef feeds them the day of hunger and ruchnis, but here b'pashtus b'gashmis. Those was the parnose gashmis from Beis Yisrael, b'mei harov. The fact that the physical sustenance of the house of Israel during the days of hunger is given abhängig von Yosef, was dependent upon Yosef. Nimmt sich davon, that comes from the fact was hat sie gespeist b'mei harov beruchnius, that he fed them in days of their hunger, also spiritually. That is evolves into feeding them also physically, but it starts off in the spiritual level, that Yosef fed in the hunger days his brothers spiritually, and then it also developed into feeding them physically. What does it mean, spiritual hunger? Rav begashmis is verbunden mit dem Rav beruchnis. Physical hunger, famine, is associated, is connected, is tied to the hunger in the spiritual level. Which means, what means hunger? Azman umatzev von helem behest. It's a time, it's a condition, it's a situation in which there is blocks and obscure. When es leicht nicht kein Göttlichkeit, when godliness does not shine. Und the Meile meyuchedes for Yosef is, and is specific, unique advantage of Yosef was hat bekoyach zu seinem Mechalkel beruchnis euch b'mei harov, that he has the power to support spiritually when there is a lack of light, there's a lack of godliness, when there's a lack of light of godliness, he can feed at that point as well and support Mechalka Beruchnis Oich Bimei Harov, also in the times of hunger, Kidlakamon Baruch, as the Rebbe will explain later on at length. That was Yosef's situation to be even in Mitzrayim and even in the difficult situation. He was able to feed in a time of darkness when there's not visible godliness. And that's the Yosef. Those is the Pirusha Pnimi in Hupinesom Vechilkelom B'merov. This is the inner meaning that he supported them and he fed them in the time of hunger. Yosef hat mashpia gewen zu Beis Yisrael von seinen Meiles und Tchunis Neiles. He gave to the Jewish community his greatness that he had. Yosef had advantages. He had greatness in himself. He had great character traits. When he supports, means he passes along some of his greatness that he has within himself to the Yidden for them to help them in their predicament, in their difficulties. With welche man can iberkommen harov, with which one can overcome a hunger. He supplied them with that energy that necessary to overcome hunger. Hat in sie hereingegeben in an Eufon von Pidnesam Bechilkelam. He gave it to them in a way that he sustained them, he fed them, that they should be able to really be sustained from that. That power should become their livelihood and their food. It went into their inner, it became like they are their own. It became their flesh and their blood, their food. He gave them that level of his character that it became part of the Yidden who he fed. High time of angerufen b'shem Yosef, and for that reason, Yidden till the end of generation, they're called Yosef mitzad them was because he supported and he fed them in the days of hunger. Weil durch them is by Klal Yisrael eingewurzelt. It was a one-time thing. It was one period of time, but that entrenched, rooted it in Latomid. It gave the Yidden for always the Maila von Avodas Yosef, that advantage of Yosef's Avodah. Yidden inherited, they took in, it was implanted in them, rooted in them, this Maila of Yosef to give them the strength to go through all the crises, all the exiles in the future. Und damit is move on. And this we also understand, for was Eden werden angerufen Yosef, Davki in dem Mizmar. We understand why they're called Yosef specifically in this Mizmar, in chapter 80. Bikesher, b'der bakosher Yisrael has, in connection. This is tied to the request that it talks about in the Tehillim, Rei Yisrael, God. Well, the Teuchen HaMizmar, because the content of this Mizmar is the tefillah of the Sholosh Goliaths, because it's the prayer for the three exiles. This chapter talks about the exiles and how we are praying to Hashem to help us, and that is because Yosef was the far, because it's talking about the three exiles. The proof for that is, that's why in the Tillim it says, Nemar b'mizmer zeh Sholish Pamim. It says in this Mizmar 3 times, Rashi says, Hashivenu, bring us back. Hoir panecha, shine your face, v'nevasheya. because this is actually uh, three times in that in that parak it says in there's three times in pasuk Beis and pasuk Daled and in pasuk Ches. I mean, it adds each time. Elikim Tzvokos, second time Elikim Hashemenu. But nevertheless, there's three times because they correspond, as Rashi says, to the three exiles. Und der Iker Schus, and that's why we mentioned the Iker Schus von Eden, Beis Galusam is verbunden mit Yosef. The main merit of the Yidden at the time of their exile is associated with Yosef. And that's why at this posik, in this Tilim, we say, and we call the Yidden by the name of Yosef. Was that he supported them, he fed them in the day of hunger. So it has more, and this has even more connection of Mervi the Maila from Yisrael. It's even more than the level, the advantage of Yisrael. The Roya Yisrael Azino, that's not enough. We're saying, no, Katsoin Yosef. Yosef is even a greater Maila, will get to come on. And the Rebbe will later taught, yes, Yisrael, which is Yaakov, is also associated with Golus, but Yaakov in Golus was still higher than Golus. But Yosef was actually caught up in Golus, and still he stood strong. That's the bakosha to the Eibishter, because of the strength we have from Yosef to stay strong, even in the situation of Golus, to Hazina and Ophia to listen to us and appear to us. And the Rebbe is going to go now explain how Yosef was different than the other Shvatim, and how Yaakov was different than the other Avis, and how Yosef is even different than Yaakov. So let's look inside. Das Borinde. Yosef hat sich ausgeteilt von the andere Shvatim der mit. What was the distinction of Yosef from the other tribes? The fact was is given, is given, that einzige was is given in Golus by an Ishu Melech Zor. He was the only one who was in exile by a person that would be Potiphar even, and by a Melech that's Pare Zor. He was Nishbal Libein Hagoyim. He was captured. I mean, the Yidden were also under Pare generally, but he was captured and he was caught up over there. He was a hostage, basically, by the Goyim. Without questioning, without a question, it happened. It was during, for sure, at the first time. After he had been brought down to Egypt, als Eved beweis Potiphar, as a slave in the house of Potiphar, and then later on he was incarcerated in prison. So then for sure he was a hostage, he was kept, he was held over there, he was captured. Not a feeling man, even in the later time when he became the viceroy. When he was already second to the king. And he was so much in charge, Yosef, that without you, Pari told him nobody can raise his hand or his foot in all the land of Mitzrayim. So Yosef was actually in charge over all Mitzrayim. But he wasn't a free man. Is er aber given unter der Schlitte van Hoge from Pari. He was under the dominance and under the conduct of Pari. The throne will be greater than you. He didn't give him the throne. Pari was the king. Euch sein Schlitte ganz Eretz Mitzrayim. Also, the part that he was dominant of Eretz Mitzrayim is given as Mishnah, the Melech from Pari. He was always second to the king of Pari, but that was a secondary He wasn't. So he was always under power. Und das ist behesem mit Chiluk bepashtus. And this is fits with the distinction as on the very simple level zwischen Chayev Avodas Yosef und der Seder HaChayim von der andere Shvatim. The life and service of Yosef and the way of life of the other tribes, as explained in many places. Yosef was under the tribes. He was in Golus. The others, they were shepherds. The shepherd, they separated themselves. They weren't under exile. The Shvatim seine Gewänder Yitzoin. They were shepherds that shepherd the flock. Abgesundert von den Yonei Ha'olam. They were separated from worldly matters. Which can interfere with their service to Hashem. In the worldly matters, they take away their devotion. Over here, by the flock, they can be devoted in their service to Hashem. Und euch, the Melacha Farayat Zoin, also the work that a shepherd has to do, fordert nicht kein Anstrengung und Türche Yitzhak, does not require a strenuous or extra trouble. It's pretty straightforward, simple. Yosef is given as opposed to Yosef, he was busy with worldly matters. First, he was in the home of Potiphar. He appointed him over his house, and everything that he owns, he took care of. So Yosef was in charge. Later on, when he was in prison, everything that they did there, he was doing. It was his instruction. He was involved in everything that was going on. So he was a busy man. And how much more so than that his Gevorah Mishnah Lamelech, his lifestyle was such, he was busy with the country, with the work. When he came second to the king, and he was in charge, leading all aspect of Egypt. As the pasuk says, "Vapicha yisha kolami," on your mouth, by your instruction, my whole people will sustain. Meaning, you'll be in control. That means that kind of work is associated with the greatest of troubles. Aber but yet. All these distractions, all these preoccupations did not disturb him from his service to the Eibishter. Und is gleichzeitig, and at the same time, gestanden betachlis advekus zur Lukus. At the same time, he was in complete, cleaving connection to godliness. By the andere Shvotim is dveikes ba'avaye given verbunden. By the other tribes, their cleaving to Hashem was associated with their matzev from his boidedus. That was associated a condition of alone, being alone, solitary devotion and prayer to Hashem or connection to Hashem. Mit sehr sein abgesondertheit von den Yonei Ha'olam, by being separated from worldly matters. So it's understood, because they were sort of confined in their own world, is Azaz Seder Avodah is their matzev from Golus. So in such a type of service in which you are separated from the world, so when you are in Golus, sein unter der Shlita von Azor, to be under the dominance of a stranger, astira und ster zu dveikis b'Hashem, that's a contradiction and it interferes to being able to cleave to Hashem. You need to have that his bodidus, that's solitary. You need to be able to devote to Hashem. You can't be under Golus and be at the same time connected to Hashem. Davke mit der Avodah for Yosef, but it's specifically with Yosef's Avodah. Was euch sein, die Kinder Tirdes von in Yone Olam, even while he was inside the preoccupations and all the work and the from Yone Olam, worldly matters. Is there Frablieben betachlis advekes b'havaya? He still remains connected to Hashem. Kemen durkin the matzav of Golus. Then you can go through Golus. When you have a situation where you're Golus, you need Yosef's koyach as Yosef did it, because the other Shvatim basically ran away from Golus. They didn't associate it with Golus. But if you are in Golus and the Golus is dominating you, we need the Avodah of Yosef to be able to go through all of the difficult and challenges of the Meherav. In Ois Hey, the Rebbe will continue to bring out the idea that also Yaakov, similar to Yosef being different than the other tribes as it pertains to his Golus, Yaakov was also different than the other Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in his experience in his life. And yet, later on, the Rebbe says, still Yosef stands up even more. Hey, steht Eile Toldos Yaakov Yosef. The pasuk says these are the children of Yaakov. Specifically, it says Yosef. Yosef b'shvas rishona hayeroyes achav batzoin. So Yosef is a hulda, a result, and a following of what happened to Yaakov. Yosef is that hemshech toldos for Yaakov. Yaakov is the continuation, the toldos of Yaakov. Or Kamaimer Chazal, as the saying of our sages of blessed memory, Kol mash ira lozeh, whatever happened to Yaakov happened also to Yosef. As the Chazal go on to compare the various different comparisons. So in a similar way, it's also in the above mentioned subject, the way Yosef was different than his brothers is also the Ausgeteiltkeit wie Yosef legabe Echad was dafke is durchgegangen the Matzav von Golus, that it was specifically only he is the one that went through the condition of Golus. Is a hemshech v'toldos. This is a continuation. It's toldos Yaakov, the generations, the result of Yaakov und sein Oiftu legabe Avram Yitzchak, and his novelty and Yaakov's specialty, special qualities relative to Avram Yitzchak. And Mirzen, as we see, Asvish the Gimel is that amongst the three forefathers is Yaakov der Einzige was so durchgemacht. He was the only one that went through many years of exiles and enslavement. He was 20 years in the house of Lavan. He worked for him in such a situation from I was that during the daytime the heat consumed me, and at nighttime it was the frost. He served them. This was unique to Yaakov serving as a slave in the house of Lavan. Or a laborer. And he was so enslaved to Lavan, because Lavan had him gesagt, to the extent that Lavan said to him, he said to him, the daughters are my daughters. When he confronted him, when he caught up with Yaakov, he said, these are mine. And everything that you see is mine. So he claimed that he is the possession, the possession is his. Was azam matzah from golus v'shibut to such an extent of exile and enslavement, gefit man it by Avram and Yitzchak. We don't find it by Avram and Yitzchak from Desert. And yet, notwithstanding that Yaakov went through all this, also this difficult period of exile, need gepoiled kein Sterung, it did not impact any disturbance or chalishus or weakening, chas v'sholem, God forbid, in the Avodah Nailis for Yaakov in this great service that Yaakov served Hashem, notwithstanding the fact that he was under that situation. Im lovo narasha garti, v'taryag mitzvah shamarti. Notwithstanding that I lived with Rasha, Lovon, he tells him, I kept the 630 mitzvahs, which means that he continued to stay in the service of Hashem. And thus is that Elfstu for Yaakov midas ha'emes. This is the novelty and the idea that we're discussing, that Yaakov is the measure of truth. In welches is nit shayich kein shinoim, which doesn't apply, doesn't fit. There's no changes there. Talking about truth doesn't change. But the far bleibt mit demselben Teukel. That's why he remains with the same force in verschiedene Umstände, in various different kinds of circumstances. Lishum shinu, without any change. Afilu in the golus by Lavan, even by the exile of Lavan, Yaakov's truth stays. He remains with his service and devotion to Hashem. So Yaakov can withstand, and his avodah, even in light of working for Lavan Harosha, he goes Taryag Mitzvah Shamarti. We don't find this. The other of us didn't have to go through that kind of challenge. And also we find this as far as the children goes. The difference between Avram Yitzchak and on the other hand Yaakov. So the children of the office. Avraham Yotzo v'nifrat mimenu Yishmael. Avraham, from him came out and was separated from him, which means went apart. Mimenu Yishmael. Yitzchak Yotzo v'nifrat mimenu Esav. Esav separated. It's the language of the Zohar, nifrat. Not only left him, but he was separated. Ashenki Yaakov, as far as the children goes, is mitosei shlema. His bed, all of his children are whole. All remain. Nobody yotza, nobody nifrat. And there is not apply at all any disqualification. An inyan for yotza, something should leave him, bizarre, in his seat. Valdos is the tchuno milo for midas emes. That's the characteristic, and that's the advantage of the measure of truth. As is in inyan shel shinu v'netia, that in truth does not apply nothing to change or to tilt. It stays true to what it is. That's we see also as far as the children goes, and as far as the avodah of Yaakov. And yet, and yet there is a big distinction between Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov's condition in Golus and Yosef. Biz as der Iker koyach mas jeder Ried hat kennen durchgehen in Hagolus. To the extent there's such a big difference that where do we get the power to go through such an exile? But kommt der Davke von Yosef, and Yosef come on, you get it from Yosef, not from Yaakov. And the Rebbe will explain there's a difference. So while the Rebbe says Yaakov also, relative to the other of his, had to stay strong with the midas emes of Yaakov, so it did not impact him, and he can go through working 20 years for Lavan and still remain connected to Hashem. But yet Yosef is even on a greater level in order to go through the exile, because at the end of the day, Yaakov worked for Lavan, and Lavan was a relative versus the exile, as Rebbe will explain. Well, the chiluk bepashtus, zwischen Golus Yaakov and Golus Yosef, the simple distinction between the exile of Yaakov and the exile of Yosef. By Yaakov is Noisef is them, Yaakov. So in addition, was ein Shibut zu Loven is bestanden bloß in dem, was hat gearbeitet für Loven. His enslavement to Lavan, his situation was that he worked for him. Al spoil, he was a worker. Aroya, he was a shepherd. And is aber nicht given an Eved. He wasn't a slave, unlike Yosef, which was Eved l'sar ha tabachim. Beis sof is Lavan nicht given kenish zor. In the end of the day, Lavan was not a good guy at all by any stretch of imagination, but still he wasn't a stranger. He was part of the family. Nor atzmi b'sori ato, as he says, you're part of my flesh, myself. Lavan said to Yaakov, so besides that, but what was Yaakov's occupation? He was also a shepherd. He wasn't invested, he wasn't put into worldly matters while he was by Lova. Also over there he was, as the Rebbe brings down from the Haftorah, in Zdei Aram. He was in the field of Aram. The pasuk says, "Vayivrach Yaakov b'Zdei Aram," that he left, he had to run away, but he ran to the field of Aram, which is the pasuk Aram, which is the pasuk in Hosea, by Aram Naraim by Lovan. Aroyet so he was in the field. He was a shepherd of sheep. Was his kenal on avoda? It's, as said before, that's a kind of a job which, at the end of the day, in which you can remain secluded. You could remain reflective and separated in solitary from worldly matter. You're by yourself. Because you're shepherding, you're taking care of the sheep. The Tamlazeb. And what's the reason why was Yaakov in this kind of avodah, and not like Yosef, for example, who was in working with Mitzrayim? But Yaakov is tachlis hakadusha v'ha'oir, because Yaakov is the ultimate holiness and light. In ganzen hecher von choshech hagolus, he's entire above, higher than the darkness of Golus. Darkness of Golus does not touch Yaakov. L'shoina Chasidus, to use the language of Chasidus, Madreges Yaakov is in Olam HaAtzilus. Yaakov's level is in the world of Atzilus. Vusi is lo yigur chara. There is no evil over there at all. Dort is nitoken inyan von choshech unfarstel of Göttlichkeit. There is no aspect of darkness and block on godliness. He's at a level which darkness does not exist there. But that's the difference generally between Yaakov and the tribe. Yaakov and all the other Avos, they were all in the level of Atzilus. Those was the Shvatim seine gewendere Yetzoin. Is a different. They were both shepherds, but it comes from a different perspective. The fact that the tribes were shepherding the flock is as given at Nuashal Perishus von Welt. Over there, it was a movement of being separated from the world, so that the worldly matter should not disturb them. But those gufa beweis, that alone shows if you have to move away so it doesn't disturb you, as the Inyone ha'olam that the worldly matter do take up place and you got to run away from them. Was the farm Musman sich von sein Pöder sein. Then you have to separate it. So the level of the Shvatim is, yes, they're impacted by the Golus, they're impacted by the world, and in order to protect themselves, they got to remove themselves from the world. So that means that the world is connected. They have a connection to the world. The others, on the other hand, they were in essence above the matters of the world. Is in an oifum from Kula Edvigdusha. Since their step level in the service of Hashem is in a way which is entirely light and Kedusha, On kein shum tvisas mokim for dem choshech von inyona olam, and there is no room, doesn't take up room, darkness of worldly matters. It doesn't exist over there in that level. They're all connected to holiness. This does not apply, doesn't take up, doesn't capture them. He says, so that's why they're also in their physical life. They didn't have to run away, but they weren't in this physical world. They were shepherds because they weren't in the world. That was just an expression of their levels, not that they had to run away like the Shvatim, which would be affected, but they had to separate themselves. Over there, it was a manifestation of being beyond the world because the world did not apply to them. But they were higher than the world. Well, that is by Yaakov. Similar by Yaakov. Afilu zayindig begolus bebeis Lovan. Even while he was in exile in the house of Lavan, his need given shayv meim keniyim from choshech olam. Didn't apply to him darkness of the world. Is geblieben b'havdolo b'reimus and golus. He remained separate, exalted from exile. And that's why also literally he was a shepherd of the flock, and not because he wasn't in the world. So his work was something which was distinct of Golus. Was a Reyitzor. Unot der Inyan, and this concept, as Oich when Yaakov is Yerid in Golus, is Bavdolech from Golus. This idea that we're saying now, that even as Yaakov descends in Golus, he remains distinct. He's not in Golus really, Hecher from Golus. He's higher from Golus. Drikt sich ois in them. This expresses the fact when there is a war between Yaakov with the officer of Esav, it becomes a wrestling match between Yaakov and an opponent. You have battled with angels, alikim, and with people, with Yaakov, with the Esav and Love. Yaakov vert der Sar ubalabay Yosef Menaged. He becomes the officer, in charge. He's in control over the opposition. The opposition doesn't take him. He's over the opposition. To the extent he's so much in charge that even the officer of Esav must admit, says, Lo Yaakov goimer Shimcha ki Yisrael ki Sirisu goimer. This is said by the angel of Esav, that your name is no longer Yaakov, but Yisrael, because you are overpowering. That means that the Golus doesn't take you, but when you come in conflict and there's a wrestling match, you take charge. Same thing is when Yaakov descended to Mitzrayim. Is Noisef Lozev said is geblieben, abgesundert von Mitzrayim. Just besides being not fully Mitzrayim, just like in Lavan, he was still a Reyet Soin. Is that in Eretz Goshen, made of Aretz, he was in the land of Goshen. They weren't really in Mitzrayim. Is Vayvorech Yaakov es Parei. So Yaakov blessed Parei that what? Sheyale Nilus Laraglov. Umashkes Aretz, that the Nilus should go up towards him and water the land. Yaakov is dervos is mevarach es Parei. So who blesses Parei? Yaakov. So Yaakov is in control. By Parei is all on this. Parei is all on Kenan as the Parnosim of Mitzrayim, to the extent that Parei should recognize that where does Mitzrayim get its Parnosim was vert al Anilus Soilomashka, which takes place through the Nile, which goes up and waters everything. That means that feeds, that provides for the sustenance of Mitzrayim. That comes through whom is Ophenig in Berchos Shel Yaakov. That hinges on Yaakov's blessing. Yaakov blessed him so that the water of the Nile should rise to him. This was something that Yaakov gave to him. That means instead of Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim and the Mitzrayim affected, he remains above Mitzrayim. And therefore he blesses him, and everything of Paro goes through Yaakov, and therefore when he battles the Sorish Esav, he is in charge. Why? Because he did not get caught up in the Golus, but he always was above the Golus. And that was also why he was a Yitzhak. But on the other hand, Zayin Mundos is the Reish from Yosef. And this is the novelty of Yosef. But Yosef is given a Yerida in Golus. By him, there was a descent in exile. Boifunazer is gekommen unter der Shlita to the extent that he became under the dominance from Potiphar under noch Pare. First Potiphar and then Pare. Unafal became, and yet is Eichin Azam Atzev. Is geblieben betachtes Vayigash and Likutei. Even in that condition, he remained totally cleaving to godliness. A high timer, and for that reason, is there koyach was yet der id had of durkin inyan hagolus. So the power that every yid has to go through the golus, because Yosef was in golus. So a yid who is in golus, how do we have the strength to navigate and go through this golus? Was by yet that id is that inyan hagolus kipshutei. By us, it's literally golus. Tachas shlitas u'mezchulu, under the dominance of the nations. Nemtzen beker for Yosef. That comes mainly from Yosef. Was der koyach hat Yosef reingegeben in Eden. That is the power that Yosef gave to Yid of them was pinnesum v'chilkelom b'mei harav, by supporting them, feeding them during the hunger days. Was there at mashpia given b'chol hashvotim. He gave that flow of energy to all the tribes from Zaymaylo Madrege, from his level. He supported all the Shvot by Chalkil. And that way it continued extendedly to the children following them to Kol Echad V'Echad B'Yisrael, to each and every one of the Jewish people on Tzid Kol Adoros to the end of generation. Und das ist auch der Seder HaBakash is in the Mizmor. So this is also the order as we're requesting in the Mizmor. Roya Yisrael Hazina, first Yisrael, then Noya Katsen Yosef. B'shas Yidden Zog Nat Tefillah of Minyan HaGolus. When Yidden are praying about this matter, this aspect of Golus, as a Zozayin, Hashivenu Hoyre Panecha V'Nishuva. Bring us back. Shine your face and will be saved. Sagt men frier the Meile for Yeder Eden als Yisrael. First, we say the advantage of every Yid as being a Yisrael. Roya Yisrael, Sorisem Elikim Anoshim Batucham. That you have battled with Elikim Anoshim, and you were able to. Vasdos is the Meile was Yeder Id Hod B'Yirush Yaakov. That's the advantage that every Yid has an inheritance of Yaakov. So we have the ability to be in charge on top. As mi'iz mitzapnimis hanefesh asar of inyone hagolus, that we are, because of the inside of our soul, we are Yisrael, we are a sar of golus, uvemeila montmen hazina, and therefore we're saying, Hashem, listen, because we are really Yisrael. Then we say the higher advantage. Yosef, the one who leads Yosef, like say Yosef, that we are Yosef. The milu from Yosef, which exists in each and every one, was them because of that Yosef part in each one. Even as we are in the darkness and the obscurity and the blocks of exile, it does not confuse their cleaving to Hashem. And their whole in their Yiddishkeit, we say, Yosef, we're still Yosef. We're Yisrael, and we're also Yosef. First, Yisrael, we're in charge over, and then even in the darkness of Golus, we're Yosef, that we stay connected. But dur them is nit nor was mizmavatl and Golus through this staying this level of Yosef, connecting to Hashem no matter what. Is not only we nullify the Golus, the mitrokta roim, them aleph, but we actually bring alufish oilam in Golus Gufa, bring the aleph in the Golus. Vert von Goila Geula. We make from the Goila to the level of Geula with the aleph. As the Gula Golus Gufa vert nepach le Geula, that the exile itself is turned around to redemption. Vert the Meila Geula Nitzchis Shenacharei Golus. This brings, therefore, automatically an eternal Geula that is not followed by any Golus. That is the end. Only Geula. Geula Amitis Vashlema de Mashiach Tzidkenu, through Mashiach Tzidkenu b'meheira v'yameinu mamish kutin our days. And of course, in our situation, as we're all in shock of the horrific and the tragedy of shooting up at a Hanukkah festival arranged by Chabad in Sydney, horrific tragedy. So many innocent lives lost and injured. The Shaliach, many others. This is the Golus at its strongest. But we are like Yosef, and we have to stay strong, not withstanding any of the setbacks or troubles of Golus, and bring the Geula, hopefully the Geula Mashiach Tzidkenu, Haninu goyim mame kidam avodav yikom Hashem yinkim domam, and we'll see the Geula, as the Rebbe says here, the Mashiach Tzidkenu, b'meheru yimeinu mamish. This is Sichos Shabbos Parshas Chukos, Tov Shin Mem Aleph.